Hey everybody, welcome to another multi-game My Thoughts On video. This time I'm going to be taking a look at 5 different digital board games and card games that I don't really have all that much to say about individually, so I'm rolling them all into this particular video and titling it A Big Hand for DWTerminator, because we gotta keep the puns on Western film titles theme going on here. Now, I'll go ahead and note here, before I go into my discussions of all of the various games here, that if these games have online components, I have not gone and played any of them online. There's 2 major reasons for this. The first of them is that I really only like playing board games and card games with people I know, whether that be in person or online. The second of them is that because I only really like playing board games and card games with people I know, I have to try to find people I know who have these games, and the people I know who have these games need to be available at the times I am, which is a complete crapshoot because my schedule is weird. This is actually a recurring problem with a wide variety of games, not just board games and card games, but it is especially problematic with these 2 particular genres because, again, I just don't like playing them with people I don't know. Nothing against the people who do play them online with random strangers, but for me personally, most of the fun I get out of board games and card games comes not so much from the games themselves, although that does play a role, it's more from the people I'm playing them with, and if I'm just playing with random people I don't know who I will probably never see again, then that just takes most of the fun out of it for me, so I opted to take the path of least resistance with all of these games and play them in a single-player context. Because when it comes to the board games and card games themselves that these games are based on, with the exception of Hand of Fate anyway, it's not really so much that I'm evaluating the board games or card games they're based on, it's more that I'm evaluating the digital versions of them and how well they translate that experience into a digital format. Now then, with all of this introduction out of the way, let's go ahead and just start delving right into these games, and I will talk about them in alphabetical order. So we'll be starting with Carcassonne, then moving on to Hand of Fate, Pathfinder Adventures, Talisman Digital Edition, and finally, Ticket to Ride. And as usual, I will have timecodes available in both the video description as well as the pinned comments. So let's go ahead and get things started. First up, we have Carcassonne Tiles and Tactics, which is an adaptation of the board game Carcassonne, which is a tile placement game where you try to match up fields with other fields, you try to match up cities with other cities, and roads with roads, and so on and so forth. And as you continue to place down tiles, you're also going to be placing down markers called meeples, which you only have a limited number of, and whenever the feature that you've placed them on is completed, you get your meeples back, you get a score based on how big that particular area or feature is, and then you can go back to placing other tiles and placing down meeples and so on and so forth. It's a pretty simple and straightforward game that is very easy to pick up and play. But the real question here isn't so much about the board game itself, because it is a good board game. The question is, how did they adapt it into digital form? And generally speaking, they did a very good job with it. It very faithfully recreates the look of the actual tabletop game with all of the tiles and meeples and such, and the interface is very clean and easy to work with. They even threw in a couple of nice convenience features, like a list that will show you what tiles are remaining in the draw pile, as well as an overlay you can enable to show you what all of the various fields are and which player controls them. On top of all of this, there's also multiple modes of play. You have the basic versus multiplayer that you can do either online or on a local hot seat kind of setup, where you can all be playing on the same device and it just switches off players between turns. And if you just want to play some practice matches or you don't have anybody to play it with, then you can always just hop into the solo mode and play the game against the AI, which is actually what you're seeing throughout this video. Although if you are playing solo, then you need to put up with the AI taking a while to process its turns, which is a bit annoying, but it's certainly not a deal breaker. Now, I haven't gone online with Carcassonne myself, but it does have public and private matches where you can invite your friends to play with you. And it even has the option to play in ranked matches and put yourself on online leaderboards, which seems like a bit of an odd choice to me for a game like this. But hey, if that's your thing, then you're welcome to it. And while I can't personally confirm or deny any issues with the netcode, I have seen some reports of certain people having issues staying connected to online matches. They'll be playing it for a turn or two and then it'll just disconnect them and they'll have to end up rejoining the match. And that ends up being a bit messy for those people. Like I said, I can't personally confirm or deny any of that kind of thing, but as this seems to be a bit of a sporadic issue, your mileage might vary. Now, on top of all of this, there were actually several expansions released for the board game itself, and they did put those into digital form for this particular game as well, although it did take them a fair while to get all of the expansions implemented here. Now, I don't actually own any of the expansions myself, but if you do decide to get this, I would recommend getting it with all of the expansions, because while Carcassonne is a very good board game in and of itself, the expansions add extra layers of strategy on top of the relatively simple and straightforward strategy that you get with just the base game. It's actually all pretty reasonably priced too. The base game by itself is $10 US, and the expansions are either $3 in the case of the River DLC, or for all the other expansions they are $4 each. So even if you get all of it bundled together, then you're out around $30 for the entire package. That's actually pretty close to what you would be paying for the base set of the physical board games, so even if you don't get this when it's on sale, it's actually a pretty good deal, all things considered. It's certainly not the same experience you would get actually playing Carcassonne in person with a group of friends, but it is a rather good adaptation of the board game, so if you aren't able to play it in person with your friends, then you might want to look into picking it up and giving it a try. And obviously, if you're already a fan of Carcassonne and you were looking for something to play on your mobile device, or maybe to play on the Switch, or even just to play online with your friends, then it's definitely a good option. And if you're considering picking it up but don't want to pay full price for it, I'd say it's well worth getting if it's on sale. Next up, we have Hand of Fate, and this particular section of the video is coming to you courtesy of Mr. Jensen, who sent me a copy of this to take a look at, so thank you for that, it is greatly appreciated. And this particular game is an interesting mashup of card game with roguelite elements as well as hack-and-slash gameplay by Defiant Development, an Australian studio, and it was released on PC, Mac, Linux, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. What you are seeing here is, of course, the PC version. And out of all of the games of this selection, this is actually the only one that was not a board game or card game before it was adapted into a video game. This was a video game first, and then they actually made a board game based off of the video game. And what you're ultimately dealing with here is a very stylishly presented game where you are playing the game of life and death, and the dealer is throwing you up against a series of challenges, and as you continue to defeat these challenges, you'll be gradually building up your deck. And of course, this deck will allow you to go on to further challenges with more tools or more abilities. Along the way, you'll also have to keep track of two resources, gold and food. Now, food is the more important of the two, because as you continue throughout the adventure, whenever you step on a new card, you'll expend some food, and of course there are certain events that will require you to spend food as well. Other events might require you to spend gold, or you can use that gold to purchase items at certain shops when you step on them, or you will be able to sell items for extra gold. Then of course you can buy items that are added to your deck, or you can just spend that money on extra food, which in some cases might be something you desperately need to do. And your ultimate objective is not simply to survive the entire journey, but also to defeat all of the jacks, kings, and queens of the various suits. Now the way this works is whenever you get to the end of a particular adventure and you manage to get to the particular card where that king, queen, or jack is, then you will engage in a final boss fight against that particular boss, and if you win that particular fight, then the jack, king, or queen that you have just defeated goes into the card cabinet, and you get a selection of new cards that you can slot into your deck, as well as cards that you can slot into the encounter deck. And then you get an opportunity to shuffle cards around in your deck, and of course the encounter deck, and you can move on to the next jack, king, or queen that you're ultimately going after. And while this is all thematically very cool, and the stylish presentation really does lend a lot for the game, unfortunately, a lot of it is let down by the actual combat system. You see, whenever you encounter enemies, it goes into a hack-and-slash style of combat, which is extremely basic. You can run around, you can dodge roll, you can do basic melee attacks, you can do stun attacks, and you can do counters whenever an indicator comes up over an enemy. Although certain attacks cannot be countered, so you'll need to either dodge roll away from them or stop them with your own attack. there's just not enough meat in the combat system to really keep it interesting, and as such you end up having to rely on all the other elements of the game to keep you going, and that just wasn't enough to keep me playing this. Don't get me wrong, the game's presentation is very stylish and I very much like that aspect of it, but at the end of the day you really are just playing a fairly decent deck building card game with some roguelite elements that just happens to have a pretty weak combat system bolted onto it, a bit ramshackle. So in this particular case, the concept is certainly interesting and unique, but the execution was just ultimately kinda lacking. Now granted, it's not something that could not be improved with a sequel, and they did eventually release a sequel, and I do have a copy of it, but I haven't gotten around to messing with it yet, and it's probably going to be a while before I get around to it. I just have a bunch of stuff I really need to start catching up on, so Hand of Fate 2 is definitely something I will be taking a look at eventually, but I'm not sure when that'll be. As it stands with Hand of Fate 1, however, I can't really recommend it outright unless it was something that really looked appealing to you to begin with and you happen to get it on sale for a really good price. Next up we have Pathfinder Adventures, which is an attempt at translating the Pathfinder Adventure card game into a digital format, and this one was actually developed by Obsidian Entertainment, aka the developers of Fallout New Vegas, Knights of the Old Republic 2, Pillars of Eternity, Tyranny, among other things. So they're definitely developers who are rather experienced in video game development, but that doesn't always translate to making a good adaptation of a board or a card game. Now, admittedly, in the case of Pathfinder Adventures, I have not played the card game this is based on. I am somewhat familiar with it, but I have not played it myself. I have a feeling, though, that the actual card game would be considerably more entertaining than this is, and would probably work a hell of a lot better than this does. Because the idea behind the Pathfinder Adventure card game is that you select your character, and then instead of stat numbers like you would have in the actual Pathfinder tabletop RPG, you have different sided dice, and when you go into your various adventures and you go up against certain things, then you will need to roll those dice based on your stats and based on items in your hand of cards in order to hopefully succeed at that particular task, but you may just not be able to manage it. Now, the way all of this works is that you're going to be sending your various heroes in the party out to various locations on a given adventure, and as they continue exploring, eventually they will manage to find a situation that will allow them to close that particular area so you can move on to the other areas. This does have a pretty nasty problem, however. It's very heavily reliant on RNG to be able to close the various locations. Not simply by nature of having to roll dice to do it, but also by nature of you not really knowing what you're going to have in your hand of cards at any given moment, and while your party can help you out to some degree, that's also reliant on what they have in their hands. And on top of all of this, you have a limited number of actions for the entire adventure across all of the areas. So if it takes you a particularly long time to close out one area, you may just not have enough time to be able to do the other areas, and you'll end up failing the adventure. And while you can certainly try to put the right heroes in the right locations, and you can try to put the right cards in your deck, unfortunately, you're just not going to have any real control over most of the situations at hand, and if you get thrown into a situation where you simply don't have the right cards for it, you're just screwed. So what we're dealing with here is a game that is more reliant on RNG than it is on any sort of strategy or skill, which means that the game can get very frustrating to play. On top of that, there's no multiplayer in this game, at all, and the card game is a multiplayer game. And so I imagine it's a lot more fun to play the actual card game with your friends than it is to try to play this rather frustrating RNG-heavy mess by yourself. And because I haven't personally played the actual card game this is based on, I can't really say whether or not it's a particularly good adaptation of it, at least from the standpoint of raw rules and gameplay implementation, but I can say that as an adaptation of a multiplayer card game, the complete lack of a multiplayer system in this is a very glaring omission. And overall, I really cannot recommend Pathfinder Adventures, the digital game, at all. Maybe if you're interested, try the actual card game out. I don't know how it is myself, I can't speak for it personally, but it's probably a lot more fun than this particular digital adaptation is. Next we have Talisman Digital Edition, which is a digital adaptation of the board game Talisman, which is set in the Warhammer Fantasy universe, and this one is by Nomad Games, and it's actually been out for quite a while now. And it's also accrued quite a lot of DLCs, which makes sense considering that there are a lot of expansions for the actual board game this is based on. And much like with Pathfinder Adventures, I have not actually played the board game Talisman itself. I've only played this digital edition, so I can't really comment too much on whether it's a faithful adaptation of the tabletop rules and gameplay, but from what I've seen, it is supposedly a very close rendition of it. And in my particular case, that's actually a pretty nasty problem, because I really don't like this style of board or card game, as in the ones that are reliant almost exclusively on RNG rather than any sort of strategy or skill. Sure, you pick a character at the very beginning of the game and that gives you a set of basic stats to work off of, but from then on out, everything else is up to dice rolling and up to whatever cards you happen to draw. That sort of thing can get incredibly frustrating when you have those streaks of really bad luck and you just keep drawing terrible card after terrible card, you keep rolling really low, and eventually your character just ends up dying and you lose everything that you had collected up to that point, and you had to start all over again, while everybody else is still just chugging along just fine. In fact, in one of the games I recorded for this particular video, I was playing a Valkyrie, and I just kept getting all kinds of really good stuff. I had insanely high stats. And then I rolled the Warlock, and I ended up rolling a quest that forced me to go fight another player and do damage to them in order to be able to pass through the portal to get to where you have to go to win the game. And from then on out, I was stuck, because the other players, which were all being played by AI, of course, were just staying as far away from me as absolutely possible, with the exception of the Highlander, who proceeded to simply waltz right past me, go through the portal, and then proceed to plant himself on the Crown of Command and win the game. It's that exact sort of thing that gets immensely frustrating with this kind of game. And as such, out of principle, I cannot recommend Talisman as a game in general because of that. But with that said, as far as I can tell, Talisman Digital Edition is a very good adaptation of the board game that it is based on. It supports up to 6 players both online and offline. You can play it in hot seat mode if you want, and thus you can just switch off whenever it's your turn. You can play it offline against bots, and there's even global leaderboards, which seems like a pretty dumb choice for a game like this, which is so heavily reliant on RNG rather than any sort of strategy or skill, so I don't know what you would actually be gloating about there. But oh well, it's a thing the game supports. And at least the game's cost of entry is fairly cheap. It's $7 for just a copy of the game by itself, or you can buy a 6-pack and send the extras to your friends for $30. The thing is, there are quite a lot of DLCs for this game, and the Season Pass doesn't actually include all of them. So you would basically need to buy the expansion packs individually. Now, they're not that expensive. They're either $4, $5, or $6 US, depending on which expansion you're talking about. But that's still a cost that definitely adds up over time. And I can't speak for most of these expansions. The only ones I have are the Dungeon and Highland expansion, and I'm pretty sure I only have those because I got them in a bundle at some point a long time ago. But as far as those expansions go, they add entire sections to the board, they add a bunch of extra characters for you to play as, and they throw in more cards and stuff for you to encounter. So, if you already like Talisman and you want more Talisman, then I guess the expansions make sense. But if you're new to Talisman, then the extra stuff on top of the base mechanics might be a bit overwhelming. So obviously, your mileage with this game is going to vary quite wildly. In my particular case, I get basically nothing out of this game, because it just irritates the crap out of me with all of that RNG BS. So on a basic level, I can't recommend Talisman Digital Edition. But if you already like the Talisman board game, then as far as I can tell, this is a very good adaptation and you'll probably be pretty happy with it. And last up for this particular video, we have Ticket to Ride, which is a digital adaptation of the board game of the same name, where the idea is you play as a railroad baron who has a bunch of routes you need to connect, and in order to claim different routes, you will need different numbers of cards of a certain color. Whenever you claim a route, you place a bunch of tokens of your own player color on that particular route, and that shows that you've claimed it, and the general objective is to have the most points at the end of the game, which you can accomplish through a variety of methods, from completing specific routes that are given to you on cards for a set number of points, to having the longest continuous route on the board, and so on and so forth. And while that may not necessarily sound like all that much, turns out it's actually a pretty fantastic board game, and if you get the chance, I do very highly recommend you give it a try. But apart from me giving you some context of what we're dealing with, we're not really talking about the actual board games here. What we're really talking about are the digital adaptations. So how is the digital adaptation of Ticket to Ride? Well, this is going to sound an awful lot like the earlier segment where I was talking about Carcassonne, but they did a very good job with it. It's got a very clean and easy to work with interface. It's got very nice colorful graphics that fit in well with the theme, and while they aren't 3D like you see in Carcassonne, they certainly get the job done. And much like the adaptation of Carcassonne, it has a single-player mode where you can play against bots, a hot seat-style multiplayer mode where everybody's playing on the same device and they just take turns, as well as an online multiplayer mode. There's even cross-platform play, so if you have it on Steam, you can also play it with iOS and Android users. So that all probably sounds pretty good, but what about the amount of content on offer here? Well, it's like the board game in the sense that the basic version of the game comes with the same exact content you would get if you bought the basic board game set. You get the basic USA map to play on, and that's all well and good, except that it does wear thin after a while, and you'll be looking for additional content. Well, they do have several DLCs available for it, which are based on the expansions that were made for the board game as well, and much like with Carcassonne, they are pretty reasonably priced. All but one of them are $4 US, the one that isn't is actually $2 US, so they're all pretty cheap on their own, but the cost does add up if you get them all together. And since each of these maps does spice up the variety of the game not simply by giving you a different map to play on, but also by introducing their own mechanics, you'll probably actually really want to get the DLCs if you're looking to get Ticket to Ride, in which case I would say definitely wait for a sale on that. Don't get me wrong, this is a well-done adaptation. If you like Ticket to Ride, you will probably like this adaptation of the game if you're looking to play something on the go, or you're not able to get any in-person games going and you need something to work over the internet. But with the amount of DLCs on offer, the price compared to something like Carcassonne actually goes up a fair bit, and it makes it less appealing as a result. Thus, again, I would say wait for a sale if you are interested. And for those of you who don't already like the Ticket to Ride board game, I'd say go ahead and see if you can try the board game in person first. It is a lot more fun that way, and once you know whether or not you like it, then you might want to consider picking up the digital version. But if the physical version isn't really feasible for you, then the digital version will definitely get the job done. So there you have it, folks. My thoughts on 5 different digital board and card games, one of which was a video game first, and the other of which were all adaptations of actual board and card games that I don't really have all that much to say about individually, but I wanted to still do something about them on the channel. This certainly won't be the last time I show digital board and card games on my channel in some capacity. I still have a fair few in my games library that I can certainly do videos on at some point, but they'll probably still be in a format kind of like this, where I just combine them all into one video, because generally speaking, I don't play a whole lot of digital board and card games. I actually play the board and card games themselves, if I can anyway. Obviously, the big exception there is tabletop role-playing games, but that's an entirely different monster, and I have an entire video series about those. Actually, that reminds me, I probably should get around to doing that video on Advanced Dungeons & Dragons so I can get through the rest of the D&D series, except I kinda don't want to do Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, because that would require me to explain THAC0 to you. And every time I try to explain THAC0 to someone, it gives me a headache and puts me in a bad mood. So that's why I've been putting off that video for so long. But that in turn has been keeping me from doing videos about D&D 3rd edition and 3.5, which I'm bundling into the same video, or the abject heresy known as 4th edition, or the actually pretty decent 5th edition, or any of the D20 system derivatives, because you have to understand Dungeons & Dragons before you start delving into stuff like Pathfinder, or Starfinder, or any number of other retro throwback systems, or stuff based on the D20 OGL set. It's a mess. And one of these days I am just going to get that video done, but I have no idea when that's going to be. I have a lot of other catching up I need to do first, so I'm going to go ahead and get back to that. And I would like to thank you all very much for watching. And if you like the kind of videos I make, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel, whether that be getting additional games for review, or replacing broken equipment, or getting new equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.